It was supposed to be a routine appearance, another stop in a long itinerary of public engagements. Former U.S. President Donald J. Trump was scheduled to visit a U.S. Navy destroyer station just off the East Coast. The visit had been planned for weeks. Security arrangements, press coordination, and naval protocols were all lined up like clockwork. No one expected the day to become something the world would remember. The morning started as many do out at sea. Thick fog clung to the horizon like a curtain, and the early rays of sunlight fought hard to pierce through it. The ocean was calm, but the silence carried a certain weight. The rhythmic thrum of engines hummed beneath the steel deck as a massive naval vessel cut through the mist. On board, sailors prepared for inspection, checking their uniforms, standing tall, their medals glinting faintly in the weak morning light. Then came the moment. A presidential helicopter circled overhead before descending onto the deck in a controlled landing. The blade sent salty wind swirling through the air, flapping flags and causing hats to press tighter to heads. As the rotors slowed, out stepped the man of the hour, former President Trump. Dressed sharply in a navy blue suit and his signature red tie, he nodded to the commanders awaiting him and stepped forward, flanked by Secret Service agents and senior officers. Photographers snapped shots furiously. Reporters began scribbling notes, recording every gesture. It was all part of the spectacle, familiar, structured, official. As Trump moved along the line of officers and sailors, exchanging handshakes and nods, salutes echoed in sequence. The deck was quiet except for the clicking of cameras and the occasional bark of orders from the supervising officers. But then something shifted. One sailor, standing about halfway down the line, didn't move like the others. He was stiff, almost frozen. Lieutenant Jack Thompson, dressed in his pristine white naval uniform, looked straight ahead, but his eyes betrayed him. They shimmered, filled with something deeper than pride or nerves. They were heavy with unspoken emotion. As Trump approached, Jack's salute lingered just a heartbeat longer than protocol required. Not enough to cause disruption, but enough to catch the president's eye. Trump paused. He didn't say anything at first, just studied the sailor's expression. Jack's lower lip quivered slightly, and for a moment, the towering formality of the scene melted into something raw, something human. Then came the unexpected. "Sir," Jack said, his voice no louder than a whisper, yet cutting through the deck's silence like a bell. "I need to tell you something." Everyone around turned slightly, unsure if they had heard him right. Security personnel tensed, ready to step in. Naval officers glanced at each other, unsure whether to intervene. But Trump raised a hand, a simple gesture, signaling everyone to stay calm. He took one step closer to Jack, face suddenly more focused. "Go ahead," he said, voice steady but open. Jack's eyes welled further. The moment felt suspended in time. This wasn't planned handshake or a rehearsed speech. This wasn't politics. This was personal. Jack drew in a breath, his lips trembling with the weight of memory. His uniform, medals, and posture all said officer, but in that moment, he looked like a son, a brother, someone with something to say that had waited far too long. He leaned slightly forward, close to the president, and in a tone that only the two of them could hear, he spoke again. A single sentence. Just a few words that would change everything about that day. Trump's face changed. The calm, composed expression gave way to something deeper, a flicker of recognition. His brow furrowed, his mouth parted slightly, and for the first time during the entire event, he didn't know what to say. The cameras caught it, that microsecond of emotion that couldn't be staged. The sailor slowly dropped a salute, but his eyes never left the president's. Trump stepped in, closer than protocol usually allowed, and placed a hand firmly on the young man's shoulder. No words, just a look, one that carried grief, memory, and a shared understanding. It was supposed to be just another visit, a few speeches, a photo op, a handshake with troops. But on that deck in the heart of the ocean, one tearful whisper from a sailor had cut through the fog, both literal and emotional, and brought two very different men into one shared moment of silent, powerful humanity. The deck went quiet as if the air itself had been pulled from the atmosphere. Reporters froze, their pens hovering mid-sentence, and their cameras lowered slightly as they sensed that something very real was unfolding before them. Security personnel stiffened, their eyes narrowing as they watched the interaction unfold, prepared to intervene if needed. Yet there was no danger in the air, only an unspoken tension born from emotion. President Trump, momentarily taken aback, did not react with the typical political poise one might expect at such an event. Instead, he stood still, composed yet attentive, sensing the gravity of the moment. His eyes met the sailor's, and he gave a subtle nod, acknowledging the request and giving him silent permission to speak. "Go ahead, sailor," he said quietly, stepping a bit closer to the young man in uniform. Lieutenant Jack Thompson leaned in, his face filled with a mix of sadness and courage, his voice barely audible over the silence that had descended. He spoke only one sentence, but it was powerful enough to shift the atmosphere on the deck completely. "My brother died in your arms, and you held his hand until the end." For a brief second, the words lingered between them, like a soft ripple on calm water, and then the weight of them began to settle. President Trump's face visibly changed. His eyes blinked slowly, and his expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. A memory long buried, or perhaps locked away, came rushing back to the surface. His posture straightened as the name and face behind the memory returned in vivid clarity. Jack continued speaking, his voice now louder, though it trembled with the weight of grief and years of unspoken gratitude. "Sergeant Luke Thompson. He was wounded in that Kabul blast in 2020. They said you were there visiting the base. You didn't leave him, sir. You stayed until he was gone." The words carried more than facts. They carried pain, love, loss, and something else, honor. The weight of it was enough to still the restless movement on deck. Trump remained still. He didn't try to speak immediately, didn't rush to explain or deflect. He simply stood there, absorbing the words, processing the connection. Around them, those who were watching began to understand this was not a staged political moment. This wasn't a crafted story for the press or a setup for a viral clip. It was something raw, unfiltered, and painfully real. Some among the crowd began to feel the sting of tears in their own eyes. Others, unsure what they were witnessing, looked on in respectful silence. The former president's jaw clenched slightly, a clear sign he was fighting to maintain his composure. For the first time during the entire visit, he broke away from the rigid structure of the event and allowed emotion to guide him. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, a simple gesture filled with meaning. There were no microphones pointed in their faces, no rehearsed speech ready in his back pocket. This was a man responding as a human being, not as a former commander-in-chief. "You have no idea how often I think about him," Trump finally said, his voice softer than usual, almost humbled by the memory. It wasn't a statement designed for applause or approval. It was a confession, a moment of truth spoken quietly between two men bound by the memory of another. Jack looked down briefly, then back up, holding back tears, and nodded in acknowledgement. The exchange lasted no more than a few minutes, but it was clear it had left an impact that no one present would forget. For Trump, it was a sudden reconnection to a painful moment during his presidency, a flashback to a soldier's final moments, and a realization that even years later, that moment still lived on the heart of someone left behind. For Jack, it was a release, a chance to express something that had weighed on him since the day he lost his brother, and a way to honor the man who had been there when he could not. The press, once frozen in confusion, now stood in quiet reverence. They had come expecting headlines and handshakes, but they witnessed something far more powerful. A moment of shared grief, respect, and humanity that didn't need a press release or an audience to matter. It was real, and it was unforgettable. Away from the flashing cameras and curious eyes, President Trump and Lieutenant Jack Thompson quietly stepped aside to the far end of the ship's deck, a place where the crashing waves below softened the weight of their conversation, and the wind carried their voices away from the noise. For a man known for his commanding speeches, powerful gestures, and larger-than-life presence, Trump had become something else in this moment. Silent, grounded, and deeply reflective. The towering confidence was still there, but now it stood beside something more human, a humility that only grief could bring. "Jack," normally composed in uniform, had dropped the mask most military men wear. He no longer spoke as an officer following protocol. Now, he spoke as a brother, a man carrying the memory of someone he loved, someone he could never bring back, but whose presence still echoed with every step he took. My brother. Jack began slowly. His voice carried softly in the wind. Idolized you, sir, not because of politics, not because of power, but because you stood up for us. Trump didn't interrupt. He didn't try to rush the moment or offer a polished reply. He simply listened, not as a politician, but as a man who had once knelt beside a dying soldier in a foreign land. Jack's voice strengthened as he spoke through his emotion. He watched all your speeches. He didn't care about the headlines or the debates. He just believed you saw us, the ones who don't get seen, the ones who serve, who sacrifice, and sometimes who never come home. There was a pause, not an awkward one, but the kind that settles when truth has just been spoken. Trump's hands clasped behind his back, his head slightly bowed, his eyes distant but not disconnected. Then, in a low voice, he responded, I remember, Luke. Trump said, the words almost reverent. He was conscious when I got there, barely holding on. Even in that pain, even as the medics worked around us, he tried to smile. He asked him to tell his mother he was proud of his service and that he didn't regret a thing. Jack blinked quickly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to escape. But one fell anyway, and he didn't wipe it away. You told her, Jack said, swallowing hard. She told me how you held her hands, looked her in the eyes, and said those words. Trump looked up, eyes slightly glassy now. She never forgot, Jack added. Trump didn't move. Then, with quiet conviction and sincerity that didn't need to be amplified, he replied, Neither did I. The breeze picked up around them, but neither man noticed. That moment, in that small space on the edge of the ship, held more power than any speech or ceremony ever could. It wasn't about Republican or Democrat. It wasn't about approval ratings or votes. It was about remembrance, about the silent debt leaders carry when soldiers fall in their presence. Jack shared more about Luke, how he loved fishing, how he used to laugh too loud at his own jokes, how he once ran back into a burning vehicle just to pull out a photo of his fiancée. Trump nodded, not out of obligation, but because he understood that every name on a memorial wall has a life behind it, and every life lost leaves someone behind holding the pieces. The deck, far from the cameras, became sacred ground for a few moments, not because of who was standing there, but because of what was being shared. Grief, when spoken aloud, becomes a bridge. And in those few minutes, Jack and Trump weren't sailor and president. They were two men bound by a shared memory of someone who had given everything. As they turned to rejoin the group, Jack stopped and said, You didn't have to stay with him that long, but you did. Trump glanced over. Some things you don't walk away from, he said quietly. And with that, they walked back toward the others. Change in ways only moments like that can bring. Not with headlines or applause, but with a silent understanding that sacrifice never fades, and memory is the highest honor we can give to the fallen. As the two men returned to the group gathered on the ship's deck, Jack Thompson walked with a renewed sense of purpose. His posture, already upright from years of disciplined service, seemed to carry something more now, an emotional strength forged from the weight of remembrance and release. When he reached his place beside the other sailors, he did not hesitate. He turned sharply, faced the former president once again, and raised his right hand in a salute. But this was not the kind of salute born merely out of duty or protocol. This one held more meaning. It was deliberate and steady, not just as a gesture from a naval officer to a commander-in-chief, but as something deeply personal. In that moment, Jack was no longer only a soldier performing his responsibilities. He was also a son honoring the man who had comforted his mother. He was a brother paying tribute to the last person who had seen his sibling alive. And above all, he was an American offering a silent thank you to someone who had stood by a fallen warrior in his final moments. His face was calm, yet his eyes were still moist, reflecting a deep reservoir of emotion that words could never fully express. Across from him, Trump came to a halt. He looked directly at Jack, his eyes focused, unblinking. The former president raised his hand slowly and returned the salute with equal precision. There was no speech, no exchange of words, just two men locking eyes in a moment that said more than any phrase could. It was a moment of mutual respect, not just for each other, but for the memory of a young man named Luke who had given everything. That brief, powerful exchange was captured by a Navy photographer standing a few feet away, his lens clicking at just the right second. The resulting photograph, though simple in composition, became a symbol of something much greater. It showed a former president and a grieving brother, both dressed for entirely different worlds, standing together in complete silence. They came from opposite ends of life, one from the arena of global power and politics, the other from the ranks of those who follow orders and bear burdens silently. But they were bound in that instant by a shared human experience. The image was later released by a military media channel and began circulating online. Almost immediately, it drew an overwhelming response. Viewers didn't need to know the full story to understand that something profound had occurred. They saw the tear at the edge of Jack's eye, the stillness in Trump's posture, the lack of spectacle, and the absolute sincerity of the salute. News stations began to run the image as part of their coverage, and within hours, it had made its way across every major platform. Viewers from every background and belief system stopped scrolling to look at it more closely. People began to speculate about what had been whispered earlier on the deck. What words could possibly bring such visible emotion to the face of a man as famously guarded as Donald Trump? But those who had seen the full video didn't need explanations. They didn't need audio transcripts or statements from press secretaries. They understood what the moment meant simply by witnessing it. It was not about political alignment or military hierarchy. It was about humanity. It was about memory. It was about one man honoring the presence of another during the darkest moment of his family's life. And it was about another man, a former president, humbled by the weight of the sacrifice he had not forgotten. The more people watched, the more the meaning deepened. It reminded many of the cost of service, not just for those who wear the uniform, but for the families who love them, the leaders who send them into harm's way, and the civilians who too often forget the real price of peace. In living rooms, offices, and coffee shops around the country, conversations began. People paused to reflect on the impact one moment a sincere connection can have, even in a world where so much feels divided. The salute lasted only a few seconds in real time, but its echo was felt far beyond the steel frame of that Navy vessel. It became more than just an image. It became a symbol of gratitude, a message of remembrance, and a quiet promise that no sacrifice would go unseen. After leaving the ship, President Trump did not proceed to a rally, a press conference, or a public event as many expected. For a man known for being constantly in the spotlight, his sudden withdrawal from the public eye that day was striking. There were no tweets, no interviews, no prepared statements. Instead, there was silence. A rare and telling silence that suggested the weight of the earlier encounter with Lieutenant Jack Thompson had settled deeply within him. Those close to Trump, people who had traveled with him and worked by his side for years, noticed a clear change in his demeanor. According to a few aides, he spent the remainder of the evening in quiet reflection, reviewing personal letters and handwritten notes he had received from the families of fallen service members over the years. Some of those letters had sat unopened for weeks or even months, but that night they became his focus. Each envelope, each carefully folded sheet of paper, seemed to carry with it a personal echo of sacrifice, the kind that transcends public duty and reaches directly into the soul. There are also unconfirmed reports that he made a private phone call to Jack's mother, though no one from the family or his team publicly acknowledged the conversation. The speculation alone hinted at a desire to connect beyond the ceremony, beyond the cameras, and to reach out as a man who had witnessed something sacred. Whether the call took place or not, it no longer mattered. What mattered was the unmistakable truth that sometimes a single whisper carries more power than a carefully prepared speech. A brief moment of truth, quietly spoken from one man to another, can resonate more deeply than a stadium filled with applause. The story of Jack and President Trump offers a powerful reminder that beyond the suits and the salutes, beyond the microphones and media cycles, there are real people involved. People who live with pain, with memory, with honor, and with loss. It reminds us that leadership, at its core, is not about dominance or charisma, but about connection and humanity. It teaches us that a true leader is one who listens in silence as much as he speaks in strength. For the millions who may have tuned in to watch a routine appearance or a ceremonial gesture, what they witnessed instead was something rare. While many expected speeches and sound bites, what truly resonated was a moment that no one could script. A grieving brother's whispered truth and a former president's unguarded silence in response. That quiet exchange, that brief pause on the deck of a Navy ship, revealed the depth of human connection that is too often lost in public life. It wasn't policy or politics that touched people. It was vulnerability, memory, and mutual respect. And in the end, long after the applause fades and the headlines change, it is those unscripted moments of honesty that endure. It is those moments that speak to the soul and sometimes even leave a president without words.